Thanks. I had the good pleasure of meeting Chris, and we spent some time talking about that. So I'm glad to hear the kayak trip's happening. It's a mutual connection of ours through Outward Bound, so interested to hear how that all goes. I'm assuming this mouse will work even if I'm standing on the podium. Is that right? That's the plan? Well, let's see how the plan works out, because you know what they say about best laid plans. So you're going to have to indulge me a little bit as one of the teachers in the room here. I am a clinician, but I also teach, and I teach trauma, and so a lot of this is, for me, sort of contextualizing how I teach trauma, put in there also with some of the pieces around the client base that I work with primarily, which is the veterans. Just to give you a bit of a quick overview, I'm going to talk a bit about myself, a little bit more about myself, a little bit more about myself professionally. Then we'll get into trauma, because, I mean, I have the mic, and there's nothing you can do about it, so I can talk about myself as long as I want. I'll try not to make it too boring. A little bit of distinction around what kind of trauma, because we start to talk about PTSD and it's post-trauma. It's like trauma. Well, we use this word. What the hell does trauma really mean? And I have some very particular ideas about what trauma actually means, and I'll share some of those with you. Distinguishing between military and civilian populations. Lots of overlap, but lots of difference, and I'll talk a little bit about why that is and why we need to be mindful of that, and then just some concluding thoughts. I feel like this side of the room is getting neglected. For whatever reason, you know, because everyone, for whatever reason, turns this way to the podium, and so everybody over, and look at this, they all left, right? Everybody in this room is still here. We got all these empty seats. I think it's because if we stood this way, maybe they would leave. Anyways, I don't want to neglect anybody. A bit of my story starts, and whenever I speak about trauma, I do talk a bit about my own personal experiences with trauma. One of the big things for me as a clinician is that there's this internalized shame that goes with having something like PTSD, and especially if something bad has happened to you, which I always find, now that I'm on the other side of that door, really fascinating, that someone can do something horrible to you and you feel ashamed. Isn't that weird? I mean, I know why it happens. I can wrap my head around that, but it's just, and I think like that's not okay. So by keeping my story out of it, I kind of perpetuate that business of, oh, there's something shameful about me. I shouldn't talk about my own PTSD. I'll just be the clinician and talk about it. So my story starts when I moved out here as a young man, 24, from Ontario, just, you know, go west, young man, out to Vancouver. And about 2 months into our stay in Vancouver, I got stabbed, breaking up a domestic dispute. And it was not the greatest welcome to Vancouver. You know, we moved at the end of September, and that happened December 15th. And this is the thing, you remember dates. I know the date, exact date. And I don't have anniversary triggers anymore, like December 15th rolls around most years now, and I don't even really pay attention to it. But for the longest time, I'd feel it coming on, right? December 15th was coming. And then it was over, it's like, okay, it's over, that kind of thing. And this was before I got into psychology. I had moved out here. I hadn't really thought about what I was going to do when I got here. We just kind of moved, and here meaning Vancouver. And like a lot of people have talked about, part of the experience of that for me was what happened afterwards and not knowing what was going on, truly. I didn't really have a sense of what I was experiencing until much later. I won't spend too much more time on that. As you go through this presentation, there's not going to be a lot of images that are disturbing. Usually when I speak on trauma, I say what I said kind of following the break, which is you might find yourself triggered. So prediction and control is one of the big things when you're dealing with people who've got trauma in their life. Give them a sense of what's coming. Just to give them a heads up. So we do that with the vets. And so there's some things here that you might get triggered by. We up here have the best view for getting out of that space. I don't know if anyone could feel it, but as you get into it, the whole room starts to get kind of in this dark place. I don't know, it's just a feeling. It sounds kind of airy-fairy, right? But whatever, I'll just run with it. We got the best view because I just look out there and I see the trees. I can hear the peacocks. I can take myself out of the trauma, and you have to be able to do that. You can't spend a ton of time in it, but you guys have to sit here and look at me. So I will not be offended if at any point in this time you just go, excuse me, Tim. Stand up, turn around, look at the rhododendrons, look out there, see if you can find the peacock. I won't mind, and I mean that. So after I got stabbed and I was dealing with my stuff, I had always thought about going back to school and doing grad school. I went to UBC. That's where I started my training. Now currently at the University of Victoria, and we used to be inundated by bunnies. Everybody know? Anybody here not remember the story about the bunnies? Where are the bunnies now? They're in Texas. Yeah! They're riding the rodeo in Texas. And so far as we know, most of them made it there. This may be controversial, but I thought, like, that's a lot of rabbit stew. There's a lot of hungry people. That's just my personal thing, but on my dad's side, I have a bit of a farming background, so it's kind of pragmatic. Currently, I'm an associate professor of counseling psych at UVic. I do specialize in military to civilian transition, of which PTSD is a part, but it's not the only part. Right? Trauma is a part of it, but it's not the only thing that people struggle with in making the transition. Teaching trauma and then just the treatment of PTSD in general. As I said before, I began about 14 years ago working with veterans, and that's been sort of the main population I've worked with. So for the personal side of things, I suffered for about 3 years with PTSD, undiagnosed. So I was one of those people who found out afterwards, oh, that's what it is. And how did I find out? I remember the day. I was walking on UBC campus, and I downloaded this thing and printed it off, and it was Patience Mason's PTSD Gazette. Does anybody know who Patience Mason is? No? Check her out. She's the wife of a Vietnam vet. And in this PTSD Gazette, it was like a little two-pager, started listing off the symptom criteria that Colonel Jetley was talking about earlier. And I'm going, tick that box. Is that what that's from? You know, and I kept ticking the boxes, saying, oh, so me waking up in the middle of the night covered in sweat is because of what I went through. Interesting. Oh, and the fact that I just about want to kill somebody when the air brakes on a bus go off beside me. Oh, that's what's happening to me. So I had all these check marks. And I remember that day because that was the day I realized I wasn't crazy for what I was experiencing. So someone had asked online, I'm trying to do this whole thing, like the cameras and people, and hi everybody on the live stream, asked about labeling. For me, having a name for it, having a label called PTSD actually helped tremendously. It doesn't necessarily help everybody, because for some people it's like this badge of shame or something. For me, it was really important. It's like, okay, good. If there's a name for it, somebody must know something about this, and there must be some way to actually get through this. So it was really, really important for me. So the terms are like night sweats, exaggerated startle response, anger, numbness, flashbacks, all that kind of stuff. It was really, really important for me to have that language. So on the professional side, 1998 actually was the first veterans transition program we ran was here in town in 1998 at the Union Club. Long time ago, things have changed a lot since then. But I continued working with veterans, and I co-developed the VTP over the last 14 years with Marv Westwood, David Cool, and the team over at UBC. I've already spoken about where it's featured in the documentary. You can check that out. One of the things from the personal and the professional side as a therapist working here is that when I'm working with people who had trauma, I never really knew what it meant to disconnect and talk about dissociation. People familiar with that term, dissociating? Extreme forms of people feel themselves jump outside their body and see themselves, or they see themselves floating up above their things. It's real, folks. It's not, like, it actually happens. Mild forms are like when I start talking and then you snap back in 5 minutes later and go, oh, what the hell did he say? That's dissociation too. It's, you get tired and, you got the food's digesting, all that kind of stuff. It's also boredom, absolutely. Dissociative boredom, we'll call it. Let's put that label on it. But I actually had an experience of sort of gapping out in one of our groups because of one of the stories that was being told. It triggered off my stuff. So I had to get help, because if I was going to do this, I can't be, gapping out during therapy. I can't be spending time going into my own stuff when I'm supposed to be helping other people. So I got the help. And I'm a very pragmatic therapist. What I do with my clients, I've tried it all. And if it works for me, I'll do anything. If it works for me, I'll, generally speaking, use it. So everything that I use with my clients, I've already done. Just because I feel like, okay, it's the least I can do. Say, hey, you should do this. Well, why? Well, I tried it, and it actually was pretty good. If it doesn't work, I'd never talk about it again. That's not true. So one of the interesting things, and this is where getting into the conversations with Roger about this whole notion of trauma, this is a very interesting time we're in right now. 1980, PTSD comes into the DSM. However many years later, 22 years later, if my math's correct, which my math is really bad, we're now in this environment talking about trauma. But when I was doing my graduate work, I actually wanted to take a course in trauma. UBC, great big university, thought there's got to be, I'm a graduate student, I'm going to do a graduate course in trauma. Looking through the calendar, nothing. Nothing, not a single solitary course for someone like me who wants to get trained in trauma. So I just created one with a professor. I didn't create it. It's called the Directed Studies. You go to the professor, Stephen Taylor, through the Traumatic Stress Clinic, and I said, hey, I want to learn about PTSD. So he basically gave me these 3 assignments and said, there's your course. Do these papers and hand them in. So I did that. Then I was hired at UVic in 2003. I thought, okay, well, now that I'm faculty, I'll just create a course and teach it. So that's what we've been doing since 2005. I created the course. Some people here may have even taken that course from me. Did you? You sure did. So one of my students is here. Look, she's still alive. She's still smiling too, so it mustn't have been too bad. So we did start teaching graduate level trauma counseling courses at UVic, and more people have caught on with this, not just me. There's other people doing it across the country, those kinds of things. But that desire to try and learn things, it says something about this, that there's all these people with PTSD, and you can't even get a course. If you're a therapist in training, for crying out loud, like you're a counselor, and there's no courses for them. Well, now it's starting to shift around a little bit. The more boring academic stuff, Charles Figley I had the pleasure of meeting. Anybody know Charles Figley? He's the guy who coined the term compassion fatigue, good guy. And his editor, I believe he's still the editor of Traumatology. I don't think he's left that job, but I published in there and really like Charles from the brief time that I got. I don't know him, but I got a chance to meet him. And then other journal stuff that I've published on PTSD and that kind of thing. You can Google Scholar search me. But as I said, I want to indulge a little bit in some teaching around trauma, because this is part of when I speak at the end of the day about trauma-informed communities of care. There's a ton of knowledge about trauma that we as specialists and clinicians have that's so available and free that we could actually share with anybody, that's not contraindicated, that's not going to make somebody, go shoot on a shooting spree in downtown Victoria. Just some really basic stuff, and some of the basic information I want to get into a little bit here. One of the biggest things to consider when we're talking about trauma is we have to talk about, are it single or multiple events, right? So I said you might get triggered if you had people you knew, probably everyone remembers 9/11, you may find yourself saying, oh, well, I didn't expect that. That's part of what trauma is. It's the stuff you don't expect. But you have to ask yourself, when we're talking about trauma, is it single or multiple events? Can you guess which one is the easier to treat? Yeah, single. Very rarely is it sort of single or multiple events. It's like, is it single or is it 2 to 50, right? So that's one thing. When you think about trauma, don't just talk or think about trauma. Think about, well, are we talking about, okay, I'm driving down the car and driving down the highway and I get T-boned. I'm 35 years old. I've had a very uneventful childhood and I get T-boned and I find myself with PTSD. That's a certain kind of PTSD. If I've been T-boned, but I was sexually assaulted as a child, and then I was abused at school, and then I was beaten up and assaulted in a robbery, and then I had thing. Well, this is a much different kind of car crash, right? Makes sense? Much different kind of car crash. So single or multiple events. One of the things we haven't really talked a lot about today, but you've heard a little bit of allusions to, is when does the trauma happen? We talk about pre-military trauma, okay? But this is where bringing in the civilian side of things, when the trauma happens is really, really important in terms of what it does to people. If you think about these as spots on a lifeline, right? One of the problems with trauma that happens at this age, and it does happen, right? Infant heart, problems, neglect, gross neglect, even being shaken, all that kind of stuff. One of the problems with trauma at the early age is that there's no language system for making sense of it. So in terms of identity formation, the trauma that happens to them actually isn't accessible to language. Why? Because babies don't have a language yet. They'll have it. They'll start to get it in this age and more into this age. So the traumas that happen when people are very, very small, oftentimes we never talk about. Oh, it's just that operation you had when you were a baby. Oh, it's just when you got dropped out the back of the car as we pulled away from the campsite. Right? It happens, right? Like it just does, but it's like, but you don't remember that, so it's probably not an issue. Some of the more somatic approaches do address these things, right? And it messes people up because they actually don't have a memory of it. It's a non-self-identifying memory, but the body still can register those things. As you start to get into older ages where people start to get language around emotions, right, in terms of identity formation, different kinds of things happen. Adolescence as well. For those people who like popular culture, you get 5 points if you can name everybody in these pictures. The points aren't redeemable for anything, but you get the points anyways. If you think about this over the course of a lifespan, when people experience trauma really makes a huge difference as to what happens to them. The earlier and the more often, the worse it is. Full stop. There's no way around it. So I love that picture that Rakesh you put up about, well, I was there too, right? Sure you were. But think about the person who's had that ongoing, long-standing, systematic events of trauma in their lives, and then they join the military, and then they go and have that. And that's the only thing that happens on tour. I was like, well, what the hell is that guy's problem? I was there. It wasn't that big a deal. It's like, yeah, you were, but you actually bring everything with you. There's no way around that. So at what age? You know, when I do these presentations, I do search for pictures, you know, that will actually sort of keep people's attention instead of having to look at me for all this time. And I thought, okay, so what kind of trauma? Circumstantial or relational? Circumstantial for me is just stuff that happens. The tsunami. It's a nice picture of a tsunami. It's not the death and destruction from Japan, but it is a Japanese tsunami, right? But this is part of my thing as a trauma practitioner as well, is that I don't like to bang people over the head with it. People's consciousness needs to be risen sometimes and sort of increased. Or relational trauma. Getting, you know, bowled over and swept away by a tsunami is very different from when a child is beaten by the mother. It's very, very different kind of experience. When you're betrayed by people close to you, it's very different. Relational trauma is very, very different than circumstantial trauma. And you need to be able to recognize what the difference is, especially when we get into talking about treatment. Because how you treat relational trauma is not about the symptoms. It's got nothing to do with reducing flashbacks. Yes, that will happen, but the point is that until someone can actually engage in a safe relationship with you, forget it. It's not going to happen. You need to relate to people in a particular way. You need to relate to them in a way that they can actually feel like, oh, I could actually get help here. When we do the VTP, part of what we're trying to do is heal some of those relational wounds that sometimes happen in theater, and not even in theater, other places as well, where some of the betrayals are what the problem is. Okay? So is it circumstantial or is it relational? And then lastly, military or civilian. I love this picture here. I was looking for, I Googled civilian, right? And this is one of the pictures that came out. It was a group of civilians being told how to support the war effort. So we know civilians are involved, especially during times of war, but in the new wars, where it's not a country going to war against another country, civilians have this luxury of being apathetic. Back in the day, you weren't apathetic. You went out, you looked for rubber, you looked for scrap metal, and you did your duty because your country was at war. Here, our military has gone over. I don't have anybody in the military in my family. Wonder what's going on over there. What else is on? Right? Civilian, military, there is a distinction, even though that civilians oftentimes do support in various different ways. So why the distinction? Well, first of all, in terms of war zones and special duty area environments, there's just stuff that happens in those environments that generally speaking doesn't happen in non-war-torn countries like Canada. Just doesn't happen, right? How many people here who haven't been on tour and aren't from a war-torn country have seen a road blown up firsthand and know what it smells like? Me neither. Because it doesn't happen here. So it is different. When people are sent to those places, there's different things that happen. There's a lot of different things that happen. The safeguarding and destruction of human life, one of the people that I worked with put it to me very, very clearly. Yes, we are tasked with saving lives, but we also are killers. That's what we're trained to do, kill people. That's what we're good at. That's what we're trained for. There's really not a parallel in civilian society for that. There aren't paid killers, and I don't want this to be dramatic. It's just a fact of the matter. When you go to war, you have to kill an enemy. You have to do that. I'm not a military person, so I don't speak from any of my experiences, but the difference there is that we don't have that. Even police and fire, their main serve and protect, not serve, protect. Yes, they do have to kill if they've been acted upon or if they're in danger, but not at the same scale. So there's a difference there as well. And then we talked a bit about this in terms of identity, in terms of military indoctrination, the pre-military self, and then the military self. It's a very particular thing to create somebody with an identification as a military person. Those people who are involved in training know this in terms of basic, those kinds of things. It's a really wonderful thing for people when they actually get that identity and the camaraderie that happens. But there's a shift that has to happen. And if it doesn't happen, it's hard to make a good military person if they can't get through that process. So the indoctrination and the identification with the military self makes it different. We do have that in sort of paramilitary organizations like fire and police, but I don't think it's to the same extent necessarily, and then with the long-standing things. Another distinction to make with military civilian is also the distinction that we now know with reservist, full-time, regular forces, and then reservists who get sent on tour, who become attached to regular units, et cetera, et cetera. I won't go into that stuff, but there's a lot of pieces around that, around what happens to reservists when they release from their tours and then they're back at their reserve unit. And they go from, you know, high intensity environments where they're doing their job and then they're parading, you know, once a month on a Wednesday at the Canadian Scottish Armory. It's a big shift. So anyways, moving into the client, so the topic of this particular talk was sort of from stories from the client base or whatever. If I consider myself a client, I have it in there, but not as a military person. One of the people that worked with us in the past, when he was videoed for a video that was going to go out to sort of talk to other soldiers about the program, said, you know, one of the hardest things for me after coming off tour was like go and speak. And this is like the Legion members, right, who are out there talking, to go to speak to schools. And some kid would put their hand up. Did you ever kill anyone? And just like the air sucked out of him. And he said, you know, now that I've had some help and I've had a chance to sort of unpack this stuff, I have my answer now. And I can say it, and I don't feel ashamed. I feel proud of what I did, but I have an answer now. Right? These are the kinds of things that when people are transitioning out of the military, we don't think about, right? The questions that innocent kids may ask, right, to a person who's recovering. Another story, everyone remember this movie? Movie is Schindler's List. I'll never forget it as a grad student. We were doing, again, post group interviews with people, and I was the camera guy because I was, you know, grad student. Looking through the camera, and the person who was there was a POW, Hong Kong vet. He was a POW. And I'll never forget what he said, because he had gone through the earlier life review program. He said, I thought I was over it. So I put it all behind me. Thought it was over, it was done with. He says, then I went home, I went to go see Schindler's List, I went home that night and had a stroke. Now you can talk about scientifically, well, did Schindler's List, does it empirically cause strokes in veterans? No, probably not, although it'd be hard to get ethical clearance to test that one out. You could, I mean, you could design the study, but at any rate, the point he was making is that it's the stress that he experienced in being sent back into that, because different environment, but same war, caused him so much stress in his mind, that contributed significantly to the stroke. It doesn't matter to me if empirically that's what caused it. The point is the two were put together. And this is, we talk about it in terms of onset of PTSD. It just sits dormant oftentimes, and then when people get older, and they start to lose their sort of bodily abilities and all that kind of stuff, it comes back. David Kuhl, who worked as the director of palliative care at St. Paul's for, I think, about 10 years, informed us of this the most. He said, I'm seeing these people, they come onto ward, and it starts to all come out. They're dying, they're palliative. They start thinking that the Germans are there. They start to think that they're in POW camps. It all comes out. So when we ran the groups with the initial veterans, said, great program, but you're 50 years too late. You got to give this to the young guys. So we keep saying, and everyone knows this, the earlier the better. If you have this stuff inside of you, the longer you keep it there, the more damage it can do. Not always, but it doesn't really go away. And someday it may come back out. It's not to scare you, it's just that you can do something now, and it's a lot easier, even though it's still hard. So what do we see? These are just questions to kind of get us thinking about it from my experience of working with the Veterans Transition Program. So this is a picture of a ramp ceremony where a journalist was killed and several Canadian soldiers. Some people may know people in this picture. So if this is a time that you don't want to look at this picture, just don't. Just look someplace else and take a break. But in terms of camaraderie, how do we help veterans deal with what they've seen and done in war after they leave the support of the military environment? We ask them to do these things, right? Part of what we see in the Veterans Transition Program has been talked about with the OSIS and the peer support, is that we don't, we meaning us clinicians. We try to create environments where they can do it for each other. And that's oftentimes what's missing, especially for reservists. They get sent off and they come back and they don't have that camaraderie, they don't have that connection. Somebody who I'm working with right now hasn't seen a military person in 3 years following their tour. Nobody. Coming back into a military environment is like coming home. So that's part of it. How do we do that? Grief and loss. This is another one that comes up over and over and over again. We get so focused on trauma, but trauma is loss. You can't get away from it because you lose your belief in a just world. You lose the years you spent with nightmares, flashbacks, and all that kind of stuff. You lose marriages, you lose kids, you lose all sorts of things. You lose your home, you end up on the street. And for us, a lot of the work we do is with men. Is that how do we help men grieve? I picked this picture intentionally because what's the man doing? He's comforting, right? That's what we oftentimes get socialized. That's our role. We comfort. The women and children are the ones who need our comfort, and we'll comfort them. Yes, that's true, and we'll do that. I have 2 kids of my own. I have my wife. I will comfort them if I need to, but I need it too. Yeah. You may, yeah. I know, and every time I talk about this stuff, it raises all sorts of stuff. I don't want to position this as saying men are worse off than women. Women are we don't need to deal with them. What I'm saying is that we also need to pay attention to men and how they grieve because they don't have a lot of models. There just aren't the models. There's models for getting angry. You get pissed off, go to the bar and punch the crap out of someone and get in trouble with the law. But there really aren't those models, so how do we do that? How do you help a guy who's lost somebody in combat grieve? What are the models? How many people here have seen a really healthy model in the media of a man grieving the loss of someone important to them? Eminem, there's one, right? You can talk about the healthiness or pathology of the overall picture, but there's not a lot of models. Okay, there's not a lot of models, and that's what we try to do. Again, it's asking the question. Moral distress. Love this picture. If you remember no other picture, maybe remember this. This is the elephant coming into the room. Right? No one wants to talk about the elephant in the room. This picture I just pulled it off the net, but it was talking about moral distress in pediatric units. Right? But I think what doesn't get addressed in our talks about PTSD is the moral distress that happens for military people. These conundrums that you can't get out of. Yes, I did kill that person, and yes, I enjoyed it, and yes, I probably shouldn't have. But I did it, and maybe I killed 20 people or 30 people, and I can't get over the fact that I did that, or something I didn't do resulted in people's deaths. I know I was asked to do it. I was a good military person. I pulled the trigger. I went over the berm. I did everything I was supposed to do, but as a human being, I don't get it. I can't rest right now with what I've done. I'm not a particularly religious person, so I try to be inclusive, God, universe, whatever. But people use the term soul. We don't have a lot of conversation about spiritual issues and trauma. What does it do to you when you kill another human being? Okay, Grossman is the first person I read a book called On Killing, if you're interested. And he's actually documented that the range of the kill will affect how much you're affected by it. He talks about the intimate range, which is hand-to-hand, no weapon, just physically killing someone with your hands, versus being somewhere in a base and firing a rocket. And there's more PTSD the closer you get to the person. You know what people's general reaction oftentimes is to a close-range kill? Oftentimes people vomit or lose their faculties otherwise. It's a very human reaction, but we don't know that. And the shame of that, well, what the hell just happened to me, right? And he has all these great stories about it. The encouraging thing for me is that he cites the Second World War, that most of the wounds, bayonet wounds, were slash wounds, non-lethal. They couldn't get people to stab people with the bayonets they were supposed to. It's much more lethal to do that. He said there's actually a human aversion to killing, that we actually don't want to kill each other, and that we have to figure out these great psychological ways to help people get over that natural aversion to killing somebody. It actually takes quite a lot. Us psychologists are responsible for helping get humans over the barrier of killing other humans. I don't take responsibility for it personally, but as a profession, I wasn't there as the 60s, but through behavioral reinforcement, 3-day-long passes, we learned how to make sure people will hit their targets even if they don't feel like they should. And we use that to train people. Yeah.
Interviewing, what we would consider an enemy or people like that. And there's something to be said for someone who's emotionally and geographically distant from a target.
Yeah.
They don't feel the same way. Like if all they have to do is press a button from a distance through a lens, they don't feel like they've actually killed someone or gotten harmed in some cases.
No, yeah, exactly. It's like a barrier, right? It's a barrier to people taking that on. But when you're in close, what they call intimate range, which I think is actually very apt. It's a very apt term because it's a very intimate thing. If you've ever seen, there's an example of that in Saving Private Ryan, an intimate range kill. And it's quite disturbing, but it's very human. So more questions for you. Have you seen the videos of the dogs welcoming guys home from Afghanistan? You gotta Google this stuff. If you're online, get online right now and Google this stuff. They're awesome. This is a picture from one of the videos. This guy's big Great Dane. The dogs just go bananas when their owners come back from Afghanistan. But how do we help our soldiers do that better? Soldiers, yes. Service personnel, yes. Anybody who's served, how do we help them do that better? Because the isolation and abandonment is one of the hugest factors amongst suicide, alcohol and drug use, all that kind of stuff, right? My big thing is transition. How do we help welcome people back? Things like having ceremonies for welcoming people back. You're back now. We want you here. Some communities do it. Some communities don't have the ways to do it. We don't have the ticker tape parades. We don't have the big, banners in the town hall or in the town square to welcome back people at the end of the war, because this is a campaign that people are on. So, and they're not all coming back at once. Not that that happened in the wars either. People came back over a period of time. But there's an end. We're pulling out, right? Currently, we're pulling out, which is very different from coming home the victors in World War II. Socially, and Grossman spoke about that as well. How we receive people back has implications for how much PTSD people get. It just does. So having dogs like that is a good thing, right? Dogs that are all over their masters. And then this is a sensitive one, because I know there's a lot of leaders here, and I want to make a comment about this, that a lot of the stuff that we deal with is about the failures in leadership, especially in the theater, and what happens. We all know that the good leaders are the ones that people will do anything for, right? And to make a dichotomy between a good leader and a bad leader, it's a false dichotomy. I think there's good leadership at times, bad leadership at times. But especially in a military context, failures in leadership, perceived failures in leadership, and that sense of betrayal, being lost, being left alone, can have huge effects on the people, not only who are under the leader, but also the leader, right? Where you're a middle level leader, where you've been told something from above, and then something that you had to do trickles down, but you're the person in the middle. A lot of that has to do with the trust in organizations, trust in people coming to things like the VTP, seeing me as a CO. It's like, well, why the hell should I trust you? You're in charge. I know what people in charge do. They don't give a shit about us. Pardon my language. So how do we do that? How do we help people get restored? Because they're us. They're our community. They're Canada, right? They're our society. And if they don't trust our institutions, and some institutions shouldn't be, but if they don't trust the medical profession, they're not going to go get help. If they don't trust the government, they're not going to go get help, right? And it's a huge piece that we try to work on, is helping people gain some trust again after coming out of those situations. So just my last few thoughts on here. Love this. For trauma therapy, there's nothing better. But if you're going through hell, just keep going. Like, don't stop, right? Just go. But how you go is important. And as a clinician, this is what I say. You don't just drive through at 100 miles an hour, because you're likely to get in an accident, metaphorically speaking. You go slow, but you keep going. With lots of resources, lots of gas in the tank, really finely tuned engine, and if it needs to be tuned up, take it in, get it tuned up, but keep going. Just keep going, 10 miles an hour. Eventually you'll get through. So that's it for me in terms of my formal presentation. Over to you, Roger. Thank you, everyone.
Tim will be back with the final session, and I do want to move on, but I'll just maybe open up to any of the experiential crowd. Any closing comments there, or any questions that we want to give Chris or Tim just before I bring up our next couple of panelists? So I'll take two. I'll be very Solomonic, and I'll go front to back. So first off.
My question is for Chris. I'm just wondering, I'm a clinician. I work civilian side as an occupational therapist, and I'm also a reservist in 11 Field Ambulance. And I had Veterans Affairs send a referral to me the other day. And the gentleman was going through PTSD. And I said, I was sort of trying to sell myself as a candidate to take this person on, to say, well, I'm a military member myself, and I've had a lot of experience in the area. I've also written my grad paper on this as well. And she said, we probably don't want to mention that you have anything to do with the military, because right now this person hates the military, doesn't want to hear anything about it, and is completely avoiding the military. And so my question is, I understand I have to build trust with this person, but we've also talked today about how it's so important to create that closeness, that camaraderie, that understanding of culture amongst military members. So in your experience, when would you recommend potentially making that disclosure and forming that connection with this person? Or would you recommend keeping that in secret? That I'm an actual serving member.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know the details of of the particular issue, but if you're asking me what I do, I'd be honest with them right up front. I mean, the PTSD piece is all about honesty. And if he or she is not willing and ready to speak with you as a clinician with a military background, then you're not the right person for them. That's what I would suggest. Very non-clinical approach, but I think it's practical and it's being honest.
Integrity matters most. Yeah. And
hi, my question is for both of you. My name is Priscilla, and I'm the Family Liaison Officer with the IPSC and MFRC. So my job is to help support the family members, and that's a piece that's been missing for me here today, is where does the family fit in this big puzzle? And I guess for you, I mean, what's for the Veterans Transition Program, how does family fit in? And for you, Chris, what was helpful for your family members? What wasn't available? What is available? I guess that's my question.
The family is, probably one of the most important parts of the healing process. And I think some organizations within the CF, and that's all I can really speak about at the moment, is some of them are a little more understanding of and aware of that than others. In my experience going through the treatment, it was offered by the CF mental health clinic here in Esquimalt. It was offered that my wife could attend at certain times, either individually or as a couple. My wife chose not to attend for quite some time, kind of until when you were talking about how things get worse before they get better. Right when I got really bad, I think there was a bit of a panic, and then my wife engaged with my therapist and remained so. So I'm very, very grateful for having that resource available for my spouse, and I think that's really sort of gets back to the whole community, who is how we cure all this. And make it better. I don't think I would be where I am today without my wife understanding what was going on. I mean, and we've been together 25 years, so she's seen me go and come back from all these deployments, and put up with an interesting level of behavior over the years, and been very patient. But she could only take so much, right? Should only take so much, and I think part of what I was learning at the same time was that my wife needs to be brought into this as well. She needs to understand more, and I was frankly incapable of explaining it. So I would like to see more family involvement in these scenarios, and I think we'll just leave it at that. We need the family.
Yeah, I would just briefly say about that. The family, sometimes the family gets positioned as the main support network, but we have to remember that people are people, and people have their own stuff too. And one of the mistakes we've made in the past is saying, well, how can we enlist the family to help the member? But in actual fact, the family wasn't in any position to support anybody. They needed help for their own stuff. That had nothing to do with the person coming back, had nothing to do with the person being deployed. They just had their own stuff, and so they weren't actually really great resource people. They just needed help. And so for civilians, it's the question again, well, what help is there for civilians who are suffering? That's really the question, because we can't position families as being, well, we need to support the family so they can prop up the member. I think that's, for me, it's a bit of a misnomer that that's really what needs to happen. I think, and part of this whole issue is like, let's get it out of the notion of just treat the military member. How do we support people? What resources are there? And there's not a lot of resources that are cheap for civilians. There just aren't. it's a luxury. Therapy is a luxury in this day and age.
Policy leader perspective, when I was MARPAC, I got on to my medical staff saying, I'd like to see a healing circle around folks who have a problem, and I want their family right there. And in some cases it's culture, sometimes it's chain of command doesn't know how to do that. Sometimes from the medical community, oh, patient privacy and I can't talk to the family. And so there are these stupid barriers. The bottom line is, if the family wants to be engaged in a partner, the healers and the system have to enable that. Point final. We're going to shift to our next two speakers, a little bit more of an experiential side. There is a coffee service, but I'm going to skip the break. So if you want to nip out, grab a coffee, bring it in, please do so. There's some juices out there, I think, too. And we'll get started as soon as the technology is ready. Thanks very much.